The Grand Hall of the African Union Summit was a theater of polished wood, bright chandeliers, and the low hum of international anticipation. Delegates from every corner of the globe had gathered, their flags forming a vivid tapestry of color and power. At the center, two men sat at opposite ends of a long table, one, a familiar face in Western headlines, Benjamin Netanyahu, his suit crisp, his gaze sharp, his demeanor radiating seasoned political confidence. The other, Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, whose presence carried a different weight, not the weight of decades in office, but the undeniable gravity of conviction. Netanyahu leaned forward, his voice amplified by the microphone and the hush of the room. "We control the future," he said with deliberate precision, his eyes sweeping the audience as if collecting silent nods. The words carried the confidence of a man whose nation's alliances and military might had shaped countless geopolitical outcomes. His statement was not just a claim, it was a declaration of hierarchy. The pause after his words was brief, but in it, the air seemed to thicken. Traoré's expression didn't change, no flicker of intimidation, no frown, no forced smile. He waited just long enough for the weight of Netanyahu's words to settle before leaning into his own microphone. "Not our future," Traoré replied, his voice steady, almost calm, but with an undertone of steel that carried across the hall. It was not a shout, not a roar, but it landed with the force of a hammer. Every delegate in the room felt the line as more than a rebuttal, it was a rejection of ownership. The reaction was instant. Some in the audience straightened in their seats, others exchanged quick glances. A few Western diplomats scribbled notes furiously. Netanyahu's brow furrowed ever so slightly, but he masked it with a faint, dismissive smile. In that moment, the summit was no longer just a diplomatic gathering. It had become an arena. The clash was not about borders or trade agreements, it was about the narrative of power itself. And everyone knew this was only the opening exchange. The cameras clicked rapidly, their flashes like tiny bursts of lightning capturing the tension that had settled between the two leaders. The moderators exchanged uneasy glances. This was supposed to be a discussion on economic partnerships, but it was already spiraling into something far more charged. Netanyahu adjusted his tie, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man used to verbal sparring. "President Traoré," he began, his tone laced with diplomatic civility, "Africa's progress will always be linked to the stability and support offered by nations like mine. History proves it." He let the words hang, then added with a slight smirk, "And the future will, too." There it was again, ownership, control, the subtle insinuation that Africa's destiny was not entirely its own. A few delegates shifted uncomfortably, sensing the condescension woven into his phrasing. Traoré didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of water, his eyes fixed on Netanyahu, not with hostility, but with an unyielding steadiness. Then he set the glass down and spoke, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "History," Traoré said, "also shows what happens when nations believe the future belongs to them alone. It becomes smaller, poorer, and serves only the few. Our future will not be written in another capital. It will be written in the soil of our own land, by the hands of our own people." A ripple of murmurs ran through the hall. Some African leaders nodded in approval, others kept their expressions neutral, wary of openly endorsing such defiance in front of the cameras. Netanyahu's smile thinned. "That sounds noble," he said, his words carefully measured, "but nobility doesn't keep nations fed. Strength does. And alliances with the right partners are strength." Traoré leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance across the table without moving from his seat. "Strength," he replied, "is knowing you can stand without being held up." The hall fell silent again, the weight of the exchange pulling everyone in. This was no longer a polite diplomatic conversation, it was a chess match played with words sharper than any blade. The moderator tried to redirect the discussion toward trade policy, but the tension between Netanyahu and Traoré had already taken on a life of its own. Delegates leaned in, some pretending to scroll through documents on their tablets, others openly staring, unwilling to miss a word. Netanyahu clasped his hands on the table, speaking with the slow confidence of a man delivering a warning. President Traoré, I admire your ambition. But let me be clear, when the world's great powers align, there are only two choices: join them or be swept aside. His gaze locked onto Traoré, the implication unmistakable. The remark was met with a mix of subtle smirks from Western envoys and narrowed eyes from African counterparts. A single camera zoomed in on Traoré's face, broadcasting it live to millions watching from their living rooms. Traoré didn't flinch. His eyes held Netanyahu's, unwavering, as if weighing the words not for their truth, but for the arrogance they carried. And when great powers believe they can sweep aside the rest, Traoré answered, his voice steady but with an unmistakable edge, they forget that the earth belongs to everyone. Sweep too hard, and you'll find the ground itself rising against you. The sentence landed like a challenge, drawing a low hum of whispers across the hall. A few African heads of state exchanged glances that carried the unspoken question: is he going too far, or just far enough? Netanyahu's fingers tapped the table lightly, a rhythm that betrayed both irritation and calculation. Strong words, he said at last, his tone almost patronizing. But the future isn't shaped by speeches. It's shaped by those who can act. Traoré leaned back slightly, his lips curving into the faintest suggestion of a smile. Then watch closely, he said. Because our actions have already begun. It was no longer just about Africa or Israel. In that hall, it had become a public contest of willpower, with every delegate, and every television viewer, waiting to see who would blink first. By now, the air in the summit hall felt heavier, as if every breath carried the charge of the unspoken. The rows of delegates, once politely attentive, were now caught between fascination and unease. This was no longer a scripted exchange of diplomatic niceties, it was raw, unscripted, and dangerously close to crossing lines. Netanyahu's jaw tightened, a small sign to those who knew him well that his patience was thinning. He straightened his posture, his voice losing some of its earlier softness. You speak as though your path is free from obstacles, President Traoré. But let's not pretend, your economy, your security, your infrastructure, they all depend on systems we control. The future isn't just about willpower, it's about leverage. And we have it. The word leverage hung in the air like a veiled threat. Several African delegates frowned, others avoided Netanyahu's gaze entirely. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré, anticipating a reaction. Traoré's reply came without hesitation. Leverage is a word the powerful use when they want to hide the fact that they fear losing control, he said, his voice calm yet sharp. Yes, we have challenges. Yes, we face obstacles. But we face them on our terms, not on the leash of another. The metaphor landed with force. A few diplomats in the African bloc gave faint, approving nods. Netanyahu's fingers curled slightly on the table, his eyes narrowing as though he were recalculating the game in real time. Be careful, young man, Netanyahu said, his tone now openly cautionary. Defiance without power is just noise. Traoré leaned forward, his words deliberate. And power without justice is just theft. We've learned to tell the difference. The hall fell into an even deeper silence. No moderator dared to interrupt now, the debate had outgrown the agenda. What was once a conversation about cooperation had become a collision course between two visions of the world. Netanyahu shifted in his seat, leaning toward the microphone with the kind of precision that came from decades in political combat. His voice dropped slightly, a tactic meant to draw listeners in. President Traoré, I've dealt with leaders who spoke boldly. Most learn that the world is built on deals, not dreams. If you want a place in the future, you make those deals, with those who already hold the keys. It was a calculated move, to frame Traoré's vision as naive and unanchored in reality. The cameras caught Netanyahu's faint smirk, the subtle lift of his brow, a performance as much for the audience at home as for the man across from him. Traoré didn't smile back. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Netanyahu as though evaluating a man who had mistaken dominance for wisdom. "Keys," he said at last. "You mean the ones forged from chains? We're not asking for them. We're breaking them." The murmur that followed was louder this time, especially from the African bloc. Some Western delegates tightened their lips, scribbling notes in haste. Netanyahu's expression faltered for a moment before hardening again. "You think breaking chains is enough?" Netanyahu countered, his tone colder now. "Without the right alliances, those chains will simply be replaced by others. And when that happens, you may find yourself wishing you had chosen your allies more carefully." Traoré's gaze didn't waver. "We're not looking for allies who come with conditions disguised as friendship," he replied. "If the price of an alliance is our future, then it's no alliance at all, it's surrender." The room was utterly still. Even the clicking of cameras had slowed, as if the photographers themselves were caught in the pull of the exchange. For the first time, it felt as though Netanyahu was reacting, not directing. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted from formal diplomacy to something closer to a high-stakes standoff. Every sentence now carried the weight of challenge, every pause a test of nerve. Even the moderators had stopped trying to intervene, this was history unfolding in real time. Netanyahu's patience had worn thin. He leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "President Traoré, I've seen what happens to leaders who reject the hands that could help them. They fall, quickly. You can talk about independence all you want, but without strategic partnerships, you risk isolation. And isolation is a death sentence for a nation in this world." There was a quiet murmur among the delegates, the word isolation sparking both concern and indignation. Some recognized it as a threat wrapped in advice. Traoré didn't hesitate. He sat straighter, his tone firm but steady. "Isolation is when you can't survive without someone else's permission. That's not where we are headed. We are building a future where no leader, no matter how powerful, can decide if our children eat, learn, or live free." The line hit like a hammer. In the African bloc, there was a wave of subtle nods, almost like a silent vote of confidence. Netanyahu's expression darkened, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. "You think you can rewrite the rules?" Netanyahu asked, his words low and deliberate. Traoré's lips curved into a faint smile. "Not rewrite, replace. And this time, everyone gets a pen." That single sentence drew the first spontaneous applause from the hall. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The sound itself was enough to signal a shift. Traoré's vision wasn't just being heard, it was resonating. Netanyahu glanced around, realizing the room's energy had begun to tilt away from him. And Traoré, he didn't look away once. Netanyahu adjusted his tie, the movement small but telling. He wasn't used to losing the rhythm of a conversation, especially on a stage like this. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a harder edge, less diplomacy, more command. "President Traoré," he began, "the world doesn't change because a few leaders decide they want it to. It changes when those leaders have the power to enforce it. Without that power, your vision is just words floating in the air." It was meant to cut deep, to remind everyone listening that influence comes from force, not ideals. Cameras zoomed in on Netanyahu's face, capturing the conviction, and the hint of condescension, in his expression. But Traoré didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch for a moment before answering, his voice even quieter than before, forcing the room to lean in. "Power isn't the ability to enforce your will, it's the ability to build something that lasts without you. And that's exactly what we're doing." Netanyahu's eyes narrowed. "And if what you build threatens others?" Traoré's gaze was unshaken. "Then maybe it's not a threat, maybe it's a mirror they don't like looking into." The remark hung in the air like an open challenge, its meaning clear to everyone present. The African bloc exchanged knowing glances, while several Western delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Netanyahu tried to push back. "You're speaking as if you've already won." Traoré leaned forward, meeting him halfway across the table. I'm speaking as if winning isn't about one nation standing above the rest. It's about all of us standing without needing permission. The hall was silent again, but this time, the silence felt like momentum building in Traoré's favor. By now, every pair of eyes in the hall was locked on the two men. The tension was so dense it felt as if even the air had stopped moving. This was no longer a diplomatic discussion, it was a clash of ideologies, a fight for narrative control. Netanyahu leaned back slightly, masking his frustration behind a measured breath. President Traoré, he said, idealism is a luxury for those who can afford it. History belongs to those who act decisively, those who make the tough calls, even when others don't approve. We've done that for decades. That's why we lead. It was a statement meant to reclaim authority, to remind the room of Israel's strategic weight. But Traoré didn't respond with numbers or policies. He responded with something sharper. History, Traoré said, his voice calm yet unyielding, doesn't belong to those who claim it, it belongs to those who survive it without losing themselves. There was a murmur in the audience, the kind that ripples through when a statement cuts deeper than expected. Netanyahu's expression tightened, as if measuring the ground he was losing. You talk about survival, Netanyahu countered, but survival without strength is temporary. That's where you misunderstand us, Traoré replied. Our strength is not in weapons or in alliances bought with favors. It's in knowing that no matter who tries to dictate our future, it will never be theirs to decide. That last line landed like a final strike. Even some who had remained neutral until now leaned back, visibly processing the weight of his words. Cameras panned across the room, catching the rare moment where Netanyahu had no immediate comeback. The hall wasn't just listening anymore, it was choosing sides. Netanyahu straightened in his chair, the familiar glint of determination returning to his eyes. He wasn't ready to let this end with the momentum leaning toward Traoré. If you truly believe you can stand alone, he said, his tone firm but edged with warning, then be prepared for the consequences. The world is not kind to leaders who refuse to play by its rules. It was more than a statement, it was a veiled threat. The words hung in the air, carrying both the weight of experience and the undertone of a man used to being heated. Traoré let the silence stretch for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Netanyahu without a flicker of doubt. Then he spoke, his voice carrying a quiet conviction that somehow seemed louder than any shout. The world's rules were written by those who feared change. But every rule can be replaced. We don't fear consequences, Prime Minister, we fear only a future where our people's destiny is decided in someone else's capital. That sentence hit like a drumbeat. Several delegates in the African bloc began to nod openly now, their faces reflecting not just agreement, but pride. Even a few European and Asian representatives exchanged glances, recognizing the shift in energy. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. So you're saying our influence has no place in your future? Traoré's reply came without hesitation. I'm saying your influence has no claim over it. The line was simple, but it carried the finality of a closing argument in a trial. For the first time, Netanyahu blinked, as though recalculating his position. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, it was deliberate, steady, and unmistakably in Traoré's favor. The applause faded into a charged silence, the kind that seemed to carry its own echo. Netanyahu glanced at his notes but didn't speak again. The moment had slipped from his grasp, and everyone in the room knew it. Traoré rose from his seat slowly, the deliberate movement drawing every camera in the hall. He stepped to the podium, not to argue further, but to close. His voice was steady, resonant, and carried the weight of something larger than the debate itself. Leadership, he began, is not the art of control, it is the courage to let others stand on their own feet. Too often, powerful nations speak as though they are the architects of every future. But the truth is simple, the only future worth building is the one built by the hands that will live in it. He let his eyes sweep the room, making brief, direct contact with delegates from every region. Our future will not be drafted in foreign offices. It will be planted in our fields, taught in our schools, defended in our streets, and owned, fully, by our people. That is not arrogance. That is survival with dignity. Several delegates rose to their feet in applause, their clapping gaining momentum until it became a standing ovation from much of the African bloc and even some unexpected allies. Netanyahu remained seated, his expression unreadable. Traoré gave one last sentence, his tone soft but unshakable. We don't ask for permission to exist. And we never will. With that, he stepped away from the podium, leaving the sound of applause to fill the chamber, the cameras capturing a leader who had not just defended his nation, but defined it. For too long, our future has been spoken of as if it belongs to someone else, as if our destiny is a gift to be granted, not a right to be claimed. Let me be clear, our future is ours alone. We will write it with our own hands, guard it with our own courage, and pass it down with our own pride. We are not here to be managed. We are not here to be guided like passengers on someone else's journey. We are the navigators of our own path, the architects of our own tomorrow. To those who believe they can control our destiny, I have only this to say: not this time, not this place, not this people. We do not ask for permission to stand. We stand because it is ours to do so, today, tomorrow, and for every generation to come.